So I'd like to talk about Megillat Esther. There's actually quite a bit to say. So today I want to give an introductory lecture to the Megillah before we actually read it. Okay? When I read it, I'm going to give you an explanation that I heard many years ago from a rabbi by the name of Yoshua Bachrach. He wrote a book on Megillat Esther called Kitvuni Lidorot here in Israel. But I don't want to, that'll be if we continue next week on Tuesday, which is the plan. But in the meantime, I wanted to talk about the Megillah in general, about certain aspects about the Megillah. We have two rabbinic holidays. We have Hanukkah and Purim. The difference is that Purim is in the Bible, meaning the Megillah, whereas the book of Maccabees is not. Now, the obvious reason why the book of Maccabees, well, I guess two obvious reasons. The most obvious reasons why the book of Maccabees is not in the Bible is because it missed the boat. The canonization of our Bible is approximately anywhere between 300 before the Common Era to 250 before the Common Era, at the end of what was called the Men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagadola. We know that according to the Talmud in Baba Batra, page 14, so it says that when the Talmud says who wrote the books, so it says that the men of the Great Assembly were the ones who wrote, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, who wrote Mishlei and Esther and Shir Hashirim and Kohelet. And then, of course, you start to realize that the word wrote probably means edited.
Yeah, because David is Kohelet is from David.
Kohelet, actually, according to our tradition, is Solomon, and Shir Hashirim is Solomon, and so is Mishlei Solomon, and Esther, of course, according to the Megillah, is Mordechai and Esther. It says Vatichtov Esther b'chol tovtiv. It says specifically in the Megillah that Esther wrote down these things in order that the next generations remember them. So there, of course, it means editing. It's interesting that the Talmud also in the same place says that the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, was written by Hezekiah, the king of Judea, and his group and his advisors. And again, since the prophecies of Isaiah are Isaiah, it's very strange that you say Hezekiah, even though they knew each other, and even though there is a meeting of Yeshayahu and Hezekiah in the book of Kings too, the famous meeting where Yeshayahu comes to Hezekiah and says, Tzavel Beitcha, write a will and command your house because you will die and you shall not live because of certain things that had happened. And then it says that Chizkiyahu prayed, he turned his head towards the wall and prayed. The Talmud says, what does it mean he turned his head towards the wall? To the walls of his heart. And he prayed, and then Yeshayahu came back and informed him that he received a bonus of 15 years on his life. So that is the power of prayer. But obviously these two individuals knew each other because they're both there in the book of Hezekiah, the book of Kings. But the point is that when it says that Hezekiah wrote the book of Yeshayahu, what it really means is that he edited it. It's interesting that the Talmud says about Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah, that it was written by Jeremiah. So why does Jeremiah write his own book, but Yeshayahu needs an editor? The answer for those who know Jeremiah is quite obvious. Jeremiah had an editor. He's mentioned in the book, and his name is Baruch, the son of Neriah. And Baruch ben Neriah actually is quoted as saying in the book of Jeremiah that he would speak and I would write it down on the Niyar. Well, there, of course, Niyar means, no, in the book. He would speak and I would write it in the book. The book means the book of Jeremiah, which we have today. So, people who have, I would say, spiritual abilities or creative abilities are not always able to put the things down in a book form. It's a different talent. Writing a book is one talent, and coming up with the ideas is a different talent. That's why in our history, some of our greatest thinkers never wrote anything. Isaac Luria, the famous Kabbalist of Tzfat, which according to Chaim Vital had endless new ideas when it came to Kabbalistic ideas. He never wrote anything. His mind worked overtime, and he wasn't able to put it in book form because book form is narrowing, is limiting. He wasn't able to do it. So he had to choose Chaim Vital to write everything. Everything we have from Isaac Luria was written by Chaim Vital. Nothing was written by Isaac Luria. The Baal Shem Tov never wrote anything. Everything is his students. Everything recorded in his name from his students. He wrote absolutely nothing. And these are not the only cases. So you have people who, okay, then you have differing cases, like for instance, Rabbi Cook. Rabbi Cook used to write his ideas in a diary form, like in notebooks, one after another, but he never wrote it as a book. Like he would get an idea, he would write it down in a philosophic diary. Another idea, these diaries were published. They were called Shmona Kvatzim. They were published about 10 years ago. But the books were published before Orot HaKodesh by his student, David Cohen, who put the format, which he created of those books, of the 4 books of Orot HaKodesh, and his son, Tzvi Yehuda, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, put together the book Orot, which is a collection of Rav Kook on things that are connected to the land of Israel and the redemption. So very often, great thinkers are not always able to put things into books. Maybe that's a good thing today that we have internet. You can put it onto YouTube, and then if somebody else wants to put it in a book, they can maybe do so. But I'm just saying that this is what appears to what happened with Isaiah. Isaiah wrote the draft of his prophecies, and Hezekiah was able to get it, was entrusted with it when Isaiah obviously passed away, and so he decided to put it in book form together with his advisors. By the way, it's very interesting that according to historians, they claim that Isaiah is 2 books, if you're familiar, and the Talmud basically says that it was more than one person who wrote Isaiah, because the editors were numerous people. So it could be because of the style of the editors, it appears to be more than one book. But our tradition is that everything is a prophecy of Isaiah. Getting back to Esther, the book of Esther, as I said, is ascribed to the men of the Great Assembly, which is in the middle of the Second Temple period. They're really the first half of the Second Temple period. The destruction of the First Temple is approximately 586 before the Common Era. And then the Babylonian exile is about 70 years, as Jeremiah says. And then we come back to Israel under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah, approximately 510 before the Common Era. The 3 last prophets came back to Israel too. With them, that was Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. They were able to see the Second Temple. They're the end of what's called the minor prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And according to the Talmud, they are members of the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the men of the Great Assembly, who had 120 members and called themselves Knesset, which of course, if that reminds you of something, there's a reason, right? So these Anshe Knesset Hagadola actually had at least 3 members, according to the Talmud, which were prophets. And they're also, by the way, the ones who, according to the Talmud in Brachot, put together the Shmona Esrei, or at least wrote the first draft of the Shmona Esrei, which was completed after the destruction of the temple in Yavne under Yochanan ben Zakkai and Shimon HaFakuli, according to the Talmud in Brachot. But the first draft was by the Anshe Knesset Hagadola hundreds of years before that, in the first half of the Second Temple period. So the book of Esther is edited by the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. And one of the first questions that they had was, should Esther be part of the canon of the Bible, yes or no? Okay, this is a discussion which takes place, and I will show it to you right now. Let's see, where is it? Oops, sorry. Here. This is a discussion of the Talmud and Megillah, 7a. Oops, there's too many things here. Okay. Can you see that? By the way, this is also, I was discussing this with one of my classes yesterday. Baba Batra 14b, as you can see, it says here, one moment. Where is it? Hezekiah and his colleagues wrote Isaiah, Proverbs, the Song of Song, and Ecclesiastes, which means they edited it. And it makes a lot of sense because Hezekiah is a direct descendant of Solomon, which means that probably after Solomon died, he left it in the family, these books. And Isaiah was a colleague of, a contemporary of Hezekiah. The men of the Great Assembly wrote Ezekiel, which means they edited it. They edited the 12 minor prophets and the book of Daniel and the scroll of Esther. Now, if you see over here, okay, this is the Talmud Megillah 7a. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. Shmuel lives approximately, Shmuel comes to Babylonia together with Rav Abba in the year 200. They founded the first yeshivot in Babylonia after the destruction of the Second Temple. There was always a Jewish community in Babylonia, but I assume that the numbers dwindled as the Jews in Judea grew over the centuries of the Second Temple period. But with the destruction of the Second Temple and with the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jews start moving back to Babylonia, and what must have been small communities become very large communities. Also remember that the Jews start going, originally, this is the Babylonian Empire at this point. Okay. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, the book of Esther does not render the hands ritually impure. Does anybody remember what that means? Jonathan, you remember what that means?
Yeah, there is a saying that touching basically the Torah or part of the Torah could make your hands impure.
Yes.
And this was because a lot of the time they had they placed the Torah in Aaron with some food, and there was actually some worries about that. Basically.
Right. Okay, I'll elaborate. In the Second Temple period, of course, we gave the tithes to the Levi and the Truma to the Kohen. These were the matnot kiuna, the presents that we gave obligatory presents that we gave the Kohen and the Levi from our agriculture. 2% went to the Kohen, then 10% of the produce had to go to the Levite. The Levite in turn would give 10% of what he received, which was 1% of the original, to the Kohen. Whatever went to the Kohen is kadosh, is sanctified, as opposed to what the Levi took home after. Now, when people had truma to give to a Kohen, very often they would want to give to somebody they knew. So let's say they had a relative, their first cousin married a Kohen, okay? So, and they live in the Golan. So, okay, they live in the Golan, they live in Beersheba. Until they meet, could take a couple of months. So you have to put that truma somewhere. Now the truma, what is it? Wheat, barley, maybe fruit. Okay, but let's say wheat or barley. Okay, so they put it in a storage cupboard and they lock it that nobody should touch it because it has to remain pure. And if you make it impure, it cannot be eaten by the Kohen. That would be a big loss for the Kohen, and that's my friend. I wouldn't want to do that. So what they would do is they put it away in the cupboard. Now, people didn't necessarily have large houses. They had other sanctified things at the house too. For instance, if they had a scroll of the Torah, or if they had the scroll of the book of Joshua, or a scroll of Esther, or etc., right? So all these holy writ, they needed to put them in some place too. Now, if it's a small house, like the apartments here in Jerusalem, well, you want to put it in the same place as the other stuff which is holy, right? So if the truma, which is going to the Kohen, is holy, and the Sfarim, the Holy Writ is holy, let's put them together in the same closet. The only problem is that the mice, again, don't differentiate between books and holy grain. They go for the grain first because it tastes better, but they try the book also. Okay, you never know, it might taste good too. So, which is a problem. You know the story about this fellow. He goes to the movie theater and he sees somebody there sitting there with the dog, and the dog is laughing through the whole movie. Finally, at the end, the guy comes over and says, "I cannot believe your dog was laughing through that whole movie." The man says, "You know, I'm also surprised. He really didn't like the book." So the mice, when they go into or the rats, when they go to eat up the truma, which is wheat and barley, they might take a peck also at the books and put holes in the Torah scroll. And this was a real problem that they couldn't deal with. People were putting the things together just to get it out of the way. And there was major damage with scriptures that were kept at home. So they made a gzeira. They made a decree, the Talmud says, that if you touch the Torah scrolls, your hands are impure. If your hands are impure, now you touch the truma is impure and you can't give it to the Kohen. Therefore, nobody will now put their Torah scrolls together with the truma because they don't want to ruin the truma. And the reason they did it was because of the problems of it being eaten by mice and rats. Anyhow, this tradition, even though today we don't give truma and tithes to the Kohen anymore because we're not sure about the ancestry of the Kohen, but even so, we still have there's still an impression of. We still have what I would say leftovers of this decree, of this custom, because when we were called up to the Torah to recite the blessing, we kiss the Torah by holding our talus. We touch the Torah scroll with our talus and we kiss the talus. We don't touch the Torah, because if you touch the Torah, your hands are tamei and you have to go wash your hands. This is left over from the Second Temple period when there's a rabbinic decree that if you touch the Torah scroll, your hands are tamei, your hands are rabbinically impure. So, getting back to this, when Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, the book of Esther does not render the hands ritually impure, what is he really saying?
But it's not as holy as the other ones.
That it's not part of the Bible. You got to call a spade a spade. If it doesn't make the hands impure, it's not part of the 24 books of the Bible. That makes it only 23 books. The Gemara then asks, is this to say that Shmuel maintains that the book of Esther was not written with the inspiration of the divine spirit? Because the assumption is that you have three parts of the Tanakh. Part one, the Torah, is the prophecy of Moses. Part two, the prophets, are one peg lower than the prophecy of the other prophets. And Maimonides talks about the difference between the prophecy of Moses and other prophets, but it's one peg lower. The third part of the Torah, the Ketuvim, the later writings or the Hagiographa, is written under divine inspiration. Ruach HaKodesh, the divine spirit. What does that mean? Well, it means basically, it's not a prophecy, because in prophecy, the prophet sees a vision, hears a voice. Under the divine spirit, there's not necessarily any vision or voice. They're writing a book, and they feel overwhelmed while they're writing this book, and they feel like this is not a regular book. I got something from above. This book was not 100% me. That's called writing a book under divine inspiration. The interesting thing is, by the way, when you look at the list of the Ketuvim, of the later writings, most of the books of the Ketuvim were actually written by prophets, but they were not written under prophecy. For instance, well, the first one is David, Tehillim. David, of course, is close with prophets, but I don't remember if David actually got a prophecy in his lifetime. I'd have to check that. but his Psalms are considered inspired from above. The next one is Mishle. Mishle, Solomon received prophecy twice, according to the book of Kings. So he was a prophet at certain times, but Mishle was not written under prophecy. But despite that, it was written under Ruach HaKodesh, what we call the Holy Spirit. Job, according to the Talmud, was written by Moses, definitely a prophet, but he didn't write it under prophecy. If we keep going, out of the 5 Megillot, Echa was written by Jeremiah, also a prophet, but not while he was having prophecy. Ruth was written by Samuel, also a prophet, but not during the time of prophecy. Again, Solomon is ascribed Shira Shirim and Kohelet. And was that all 5? I think that was, and then we have, of course, Esther. I'm going to jump over Esther for a moment. Daniel is written by Daniel, who is not a prophet, but actually he's very unusual, because even though he's not a prophet, he actually sees visions. He's like the highest level of divine spirit before prophecy. In fact, the Christians consider Daniel a prophet because he sees all these visions and he hears things. But in our tradition, Daniel is not a prophet because in chapter 12, when he sees the vision with Michael and these 2 guys standing on the 2 riverbanks asking when the end of these days would happen, and Daniel listens to all this and reports it in his book, and he says, I heard all this, but I did not understand. Prophets always understand their prophecy, without exception. So Daniel is like 1 peg lower than the prophets. And even if we, so what's unusual about Esther, when you look at it this way, it's not written by prophets. Okay, it's one of the few books of the Ketuvim which is not written by a prophet, even though those other books were not written during the prime of prophecy. While that person had prophecy, but they were written by prophets. There are 2 other books which are like that. 3 other books. Well, okay, so Daniel, as I said, he's almost a level of prophet, but he's not. So he easily fits into the Ketuvim because he does see vision and hear things, which Esther and Mordechai definitely do not do. And they're also in Persia at the time, in Chutz La'aretz. Ezra and Nehemiah, you can make the argument also that they're definitely not prophets. But the truth is, if you look at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, which are also ascribed to Ezra and Nehemiah, these are basically historical documents. So even though they're part of the Ketuvim, and according to our tradition, they are written in Ruach HaKodesh, in Holy Spirit, Divine Spirit, but the content is just what I would call a historical content. There's less attempt to give across a message. Esther is what I call the last of the biblical books, aside from Daniel. Daniel is, but before Daniel is the last biblical book trying to give a definite message. Daniel too, by the way. So there's no reason, let's say, to doubt Ezra and Nehemiah because they're not trying to give that message. But Esther is. And really the question really about this is Esther written in divine spirit, or is it just a book? Remember, the people in this discussion have been reading the scroll of Esther for Purim since they were kids. That's not the question. They have no problem with the holiday of Purim. They have no problem with reading the scroll of Esther on the holiday of Purim. The only question is it part of the Bible? That's the question. By the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in Qumran in the 1950s or early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, contain, of course, fragments of the Masoretic text of the Bible. If you go to the Shrine of the Book, the Israel Museum, you will see there the whole book of Isaiah in that little thing going around in a circle in the middle, a facsimile. And they're fragments of the rest of the Bible, except for one book. Nothing from the book of Esther and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, it's not clear what the reason for that is. It could be that by chance there is no fragment from the book of Esther. It is possible. But it's also possible that the Essenes who were living in Qumran did not consider the book of Esther Holy Writ, because they lived in the 1st century, and this is a discussion from the beginning of the 3rd century in Babylonia. Meaning there were still people who were wondering, how is it that Esther slipped into the canon of our Bible? Now, it remained that way. I'll tell you something else too. It appears that this question is not whether Esther should be in the Bible, because as I said, the canon of our Bible is finished by 300 or 250 before the Common Era. The question is it really supposed to be part of the canon of the Bible? And I'll tell you why I put it this way. Because the apocryphal books, which are written anywhere from 230 before the Common Era till about 50 before the Common Era, nobody even suggests that they should be part of the Bible. Not even a question. For 2 reasons. Number one, they definitely missed the boat. They're written late. And number 2, they're not part of it. Remember, the canon of the Bible is set already by the men of the Great Assembly. Once the men of the Great Assembly are behind us, nobody even thinks about putting another book into the Bible. So the apocryphal literature never had a chance. But the literature that was already there, there's a discussion of Esther is the latest discussion. Let me just show you another little fragment of this in the Talmud in Megillah. The Gemara raises an objection from a Baraita. Rabbi Meir says the book of Kohelet does not render the hands ritually impure. Meaning Rabbi Meir of the 2nd century says even Kohelet really shouldn't be part of the Bible. It doesn't have the sanctity of sacred scrolls. That's what he's interpreting. This is a translation which also has interpretation. But there's a dispute with regards to the Song of Songs. And Rabbi Yossi says the Song of Songs does render the hands impure, meaning it is part of the Bible, but there's a dispute with Kohelet. Rabbi Shimon says, no, the ruling with regard to Kohelet is one of the leniencies of Beit Shammai and the stringencies of Beit Hillel. And Beit Hillel says it does make the hands impure, and Beit Shammai says it doesn't. But everybody agrees that Ruth in the Song of Songs and Esther renders the hands ritually impure. In general, this argument about Kohelet, Mishlei, and Shir Shirim, the 3 books were ascribed to Solomon. The question is whether it's the wisdom of Solomon, because he was, according to the Bible, the wisest man who ever lived, or was it written under divine inspiration? That's the question. Nobody's saying you shouldn't read these books. The only question is whether they are Holy Writ, yes or no. In the end, of course, they were all accepted, and even the scroll of Esther was accepted because it's part of our Tanakh today. But the deliberation in the Talmud is, first of all, it gives you an indication, according to the Talmud, what does it mean to qualify for the Ketuvim? It means that it had to be written under what's called Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, or else it doesn't qualify. Secondly, the second question was, even if Solomon was somebody who received prophecy, maybe Mishlei are part of the proverbs of his wisdom. Maybe the Song of Songs is part of his wisdom. Maybe Kohelet is part of his wisdom. Who says it has to be part of the Bible? But it was in the end. Okay. So what was the problem with Esther? Esther is the one, by the way, that the Talmud here on the next page will give a whole page of an attempt to prove that Esther was written under divine inspiration. They'll try to prove from the Psukim, how did this happen? It must have been divine inspiration. How did Mordechai know about the plot of Bigtan of Teresh against Achashverosh? It must have been divine. They're going to go into all these calisthenics to try to figure out to prove it, to show that Esther actually was under divine inspiration. Having said that, that was not the only thing that bothered people about the book of Esther. What else bothered people about the book of Esther? What do you think? What's the most obvious when you read the book of Esther?
There's no name of Hashem is not mentioned.
God's name is not mentioned even once. What other book is like that, by the way? There's another book in the Bible where God's name is not mentioned even once.
Toilet.
No, it is. And the spirit shall return to God who gave it. Kohelet chapter 3. Yeah. No. Anybody remember? Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs. Shir Hashirim, God's name is not mentioned even once. It does, in one place it says, Shalhevet Yah, which literally means a fire of God, but it means a great fire. A great fire, right? Shalhevet Yah. But no, in Song of Songs. Now, the funny thing is that both in Esther and in Song of Songs, there are actually places where God's name should have been mentioned, but were not. And you get the feeling that the text is playing with you. Let me give you the example from Song of Songs. 3 times in the Song of Songs it says, Hishbati etchem benot Yerushalayim. I have made you swear, O daughters of Jerusalem. B'tzvaot u'ba'elot hasadeh. I made you swear by the deers and by the antelope of the fields. Im ta'iru v'im tororu et ahava, lest you shall arouse the love until the proper time comes. Now, in the Bible, we know, like in Genesis with Abraham, or in the book of Samuel, when people swear, they always swear by God's name. Abraham says, I lift up my hand to the God of all high, that I will not take anything from the spoils, not even a shoestring, right? He swears by God's name. In Samuel, David says, may God do this to me if I do not do such a thing, right? In the Bible, people always swore by God's name. What does it mean to swear by the deer and the antelope? What type of oath is that? Who swears by deer and antelope? But if you look at the words in Shir Hashim, what does it say? Tzevaot. Tzevaot is supposedly the plural of tzvi, which is a deer. But Tzvaot is also the Lord of hosts, Hashem Tzvaot, right? So it also reminds us of God's name. Let's look at the next one. Ayalot Hasadeh, which is the antelope, Ayala. Ayalot Hasadeh, the antelope of the field. If you look very carefully at those 2 words, Ayalot Hasadeh, it looks exactly like the biblical name El Shaddai. So basically, it's a trick. They need to say swearing by Hashem Tzvaot and El Shaddai, but instead they call it the deer and the antelope. Meaning whoever's writing the song doesn't want God's name to be in the song, which would probably strengthen Rabbi Akiva's opinion that the song is a metaphor. Since it's a metaphor, they want to remain with the metaphor, meaning it's a symbol. It's a symbol, it's a mashal, it's a parable. And since they want to remain in the mashal, and so you have to understand that the nimshal, the meaning of the parable, is God's name. But we're calling it the deer and the antelope. Now, getting to the book of Esther, you have a similar thing. Chapter 4, Mordechai goes over to Esther, and he says, when he tells her what Haman's decided to do to the Jewish people, says, if at this time you decide to hide in the king's palace, salvation shall come to the Jewish people from another place, and you and your family will be decimated. What's another place? Which other place is it going to come from? Why can't he say from God? Why does it have to be another place? What is this, a Marxist pamphlet? Okay, it's like even the places where it's so obvious that God's name should be, it's like on purpose, the narrative is looking for some out not to do it. Now, let me show you, this really bothered people living in the Second Temple period, and let me prove it to you. The document you're looking at right now is called the Additions to the Book of Esther. No, this is the Book of Esther, I'm sorry. Hey, that's the wrong one. It's not the one I wanted. Hold on. I hope I didn't. Is it here? Oh my. Oh, hold on, I'm sorry. We're not going to get that far, so okay, let me push this away. Maybe I did put it here. Oh no, here it is. Okay. Oh, you can't see that. One moment. I see what happened. Okay. Share screen. Can you see this?
Not yet.
Oh, you can see it. Okay. I didn't know you could see it. Okay. Here it is.
Now we can see it.
I forgot that I recopied it. Okay, this is called The Rest of Esther, Tosafot the Megillat Esther. It's taken from the Apocrypha, the books that did not make their way into the Bible. And it's called Tosafot, or either Second Esther or the appendix to the book of Esther. In English, they call it The Rest of Esther. Okay. And in The Rest of Esther, this is just, I'm just quoting one chapter here, is everything that bothered people in the Second Temple period about the book of Esther. They took it all out and put it into the Apocrypha. Okay, in other words, you can read that book, I'll tell you how to read it. You know, it's like if you read the Art Scroll. Ever see the Art Scroll translation of the Song of Songs? So it really bothers them, you know, that the Song of Songs is this erotic love poetry in the Bible. So what they do is they actually bring you Rashi's metaphoric interpretation, and they make that the translation. They don't actually, they take away the book. Okay, so something like that is happening in Esther 2. Let me read. Chapter 14 of Esther 2. Queen Esther, oh, let's go even before. It starts with Mordechai in chapter 13. Here it is. Apocryphal additions to Esther. Mordechai thought upon all the works of the Lord and made his prayer unto him, saying, O God, the Almighty King, the whole world is in your power. You have appointed to save Israel, and no man can gainsay thee. You have made the heaven and the earth and wondrous things. Lord of all things, there's no man who can resist you, because you are God. You know everything, etc. For I could have been content with the goodwill of the salvation of Israel, and I could have kissed the soles of the feet of Haman, he's referring to. But I did this, and I preferred the glory, I did not prefer the glory of man over the glory of God, and I did not worship him, I only worship you. And O God, spare your people, for their eyes are upon you. Despite not the portion which you have delivered out of Egypt. Hear my prayer, be merciful. Turn our sorrow into joy that we may live. All Israel in like manner cried earnestly unto God, because their death was imminent before their eyes. So basically Mordechai is praying to God and asking for cancel the Haman's decree. Esther does the same thing. Queen Esther also, in fear of death, retorted to God and laid down her glorious apparel and put on the garments of anguish. And she covered her hair with ashes and humbled herself. And she prayed to God, saying, "O God, you are the king. Help me, a desolate woman, which has no helper but you. Danger is in my hand. From my youth I have heard in the tribe of my family that you took Israel from among the people, etc., etc. And now we have sinned, we have worshipped their gods, etc. Remember our affliction, give us boldness, etc., etc. So basically, Mordechai is praying, and Esther is praying, and then Mordechai is praying, and Esther is praying. In fact, God's name is mentioned so many times in apocryphal Esther, it's enough to make up more than one book of Esther. So I think you understand the problem that whoever wrote the appendix to the book of Esther had with the book of Esther. It's too secular. What's this book doing in our Bible? Ashanda. So somebody had a problem, and this is Second Esther. So even though it's not part of the Bible, it's not Holy Writ, Second Esther, it really is a good sociological understanding of the people living in the Second Temple period, wondering what this book of Esther is all about and what you're supposed to do with it. So basically, and here I come to the end of my little introduction number 1 today. Esther, the book of Esther had a hard time. The Talmud wonders whether it should be part of the Bible, and eventually it's let in, but it's an ongoing, it seems the only book where there's a lingering question of its legitimacy. Secondly, as I said, it's a book which is written with a message, but not by prophets. Even the books of the Ketuvim, which are what I call message books, they're really usually written by prophets in most cases, unless they're historical, like Divrei Hayamim and Ezra and Nehemiah. And third, because God's name was not mentioned, it really bothered people to such an extent that somebody put together a book, all the missing parts, the censored parts of Esther, let's put them back in and tell everybody it used to be there, okay? They really had a problem with this. So the question is why? Why is Esther written the way it is? And I'll leave you with one last thing. And then if you want to ask questions, bavakasha. There's one other question about the whole book of Esther. If you, I had this chart, which I just took from the internet from somebody, seems to go on and on. I'll just tell you what it is. It's in Ivrit by somebody from the Maleh Adumim Yeshiva. He tries to figure out the timeline of the scroll of Esther based on Rashi, Radak of Italy, Avraham ibn Ezra, different Parshanim, different Middle Ages Bible commentaries. Because as you know, Hanukkah, we know exactly when it happened. The revolt was from 167 before the Common Era till about 165 or 164. Took about 3.5 years. We know exactly when it happened, who the people were, and the book of Maccabees 1 gives a very detailed description, obviously written by somebody who knew all about it. The problem with the scroll of Esther is it's very hard to place it historically. The Talmud seems to imply that it happens towards the end of the Babylonian exile. Which, if that's true, okay, it's still happening in the exile, and then after that, the Jews will go forth to Israel. However, there's only one problem with that. The name of the king who is in the Megillat Esther, his name is Achashverosh. Now we know that Cyrus, who is the king who told the Jews that they could go back, and Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel take that opportunity and do go back in the Second Temple period. Cyrus is the first Persian king. And not only that, the scroll of Esther is happening under a Persian kingdom. That's why they even have Persian words like Purim, which means a lottery. Okay, and other words are Takshasta and Pachot, and which are Persian words. Now, as you can see, according to the Bible commentaries, Koresh is the first Persian king, Daryavesh the Mede is before him, and after that is Achashverosh. Okay, there's more than one Achashverosh in the book of Daniel, but now why do I mention this? I purposely am not looking at what the historians say. The historians actually say that the Persian era was much longer, about 200 years longer. But I'm looking particularly what the rabbinic authorities are saying. Because if this is correct, I mean, okay, the Talmud says what it says, but if this is correct, is the Megillah story happening after the Jews already went back to the Second Temple period and built the temple? Meaning, is it happening now? Is this now the Jews living in New York while the state of Israel was already founded? Is that the story of Esther? If that's the story, wow, that changes the scenario. Okay, it's like a whole different ballgame if that's the story. Because why didn't they make Aliyah? Like the whole thing looks different if that's so. If it's true what these Parshanim say, that Darius the Mede is before Cyrus, and then comes Achashverosh, even if there's more than one Achashverosh, does that mean the Megillah story is happening after Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel already made Aliyah to Judea? Okay, interesting question. I don't know 100% the answer, only because, as I said, the Talmud assumes it's still during the Babylonian exile. But it's not clear historically, if it's Persian, when exactly that would have been. So, these are questions I'm going to try to answer some of these questions next week. I hope I didn't leave too much of a cliffhanger so that you'll be able to sleep tonight. And that's it. I didn't want to go more than 45 minutes. I'm going to hold it right here. If there are any questions, if you want a quick question, bavakasha.